Story 2. The Vanishing Hiker. Tom and Sarah were avid hikers, always seeking new trails and adventures. One summer, they planned a trip to a remote national park, known for its rugged beauty and challenging terrain. The park had a reputation for being a bit dangerous, with stories of hikers getting lost or injured, but that only added to the allure for the adventurous couple. They arrived at the park early in the morning, excited to explore the wilderness. Their plan was to hike a challenging trail that would take them deep into the forest and up to a stunning viewpoint. They packed plenty of supplies, including a map, compass, and GPS device, confident in their ability to navigate the terrain. The hike started off beautifully. The weather was perfect, and the scenery was breathtaking. They marveled at the dense forest, the vibrant wildflowers, and the distant mountains. As they ventured deeper into the forest, they encountered fewer and fewer hikers, until they were completely alone. After several hours of hiking, they reached a fork in the trail. According to their map, both paths would eventually lead to the viewpoint, but one was significantly longer and more challenging. Eager for an adventure, they chose the more difficult path. As they hiked, the trail became increasingly difficult to follow. Overgrown vegetation and fallen trees obscured the path, and they had to rely on their map and compass to navigate. The forest grew denser, and an eerie silence settled around them. Despite their experience, they began to feel uneasy. After several hours, they realized they were lost. The trail had disappeared entirely, and their GPS device was malfunctioning. Panic set in as they tried to retrace their steps, but the forest all looked the same. They had plenty of supplies, but the realization that they were lost in a vast, remote wilderness was terrifying. As night began to fall, they decided to set up camp and try to find their way back in the morning. They built a small fire and huddled together for warmth, their minds racing with worry. The silence of the forest was broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant howl of an animal. In the middle of the night, Sarah was awakened by a strange sound. It was a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone tapping a stick against a tree. She shook Tom awake, and they listened intently. The tapping continued, growing louder and closer. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Tom nodded, his eyes wide with fear. They grabbed their flashlights and cautiously stepped out of their tent. The tapping seemed to be coming from all around them, echoing through the forest. They shone their flashlights into the darkness, but saw nothing. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. The silence was deafening, and they could hear their own rapid breathing. Then, a low, guttural growl echoed through the trees. They spun around, shining their flashlights wildly, but still saw nothing. "Let's get back in the tent," Tom said, his voice shaking. They retreated to the safety of their tent, zipping it up tightly. They huddled together, clutching their flashlights and listening for any sign of danger. The rest of the night was filled with strange sounds, distant footsteps, branches snapping, and that eerie tapping. They barely slept, too terrified to close their eyes. When morning finally came, they packed up their camp and set off, desperate to find their way back to the main trail. As they hiked, they found strange symbols carved into the trees, unlike anything they had ever seen. The symbols seemed to mark a path, and they decided to follow them, hoping they would lead them back to safety. But as they followed the symbols, they felt an overwhelming sense of dread. After hours of hiking, they stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin deep in the forest. The cabin was in disrepair, its windows shattered and the door hanging off its hinges. Despite their fear, they decided to investigate, hoping to find a map or some clue to help them find their way. Inside the cabin, they found old, dusty furniture and walls covered in strange drawings. The symbols they had seen on the trees were etched into the walls, along with disturbing images of twisted figures and eerie landscapes. They found an old journal on a table, filled with ramblings about creatures in the forest and dark rituals. As they read the journal, a sense of horror washed over them. According to the journal, The forest was home to ancient, malevolent spirits that lured hikers into their domain. The tapping sound was a warning, and the symbols were meant to mark the boundaries of the spirits' territory. Terrified, Tom and Sarah decided to leave the cabin immediately. But as they stepped outside, they heard the tapping sound again, louder and more insistent. They ran through the forest, desperate to escape, but the tapping seemed to follow them, growing louder with every step. Hours later, they stumbled onto the main trail, exhausted and terrified. They made their way back to the park entrance and reported their experience to the rangers. The rangers listened to their story with a mix of skepticism and concern, but there was little they could do. Tom and Sarah left the park, vowing never to return. They tried to put the experience behind them, but the memory of the eerie tapping and the strange symbols haunted them. They couldn't shake the feeling that they had encountered something truly sinister in the forest, and they never went hiking again.